So those of you that are just now coming on, I opened up a little early. We have a lot of information to get to. I'm going to let you come in. I'm going to let all the people get in they're going to be here. There'll be a number of people on this webinar. And then we'll get started here in about 2 to 3 minutes max. So if you need to do anything, if you have to grab something to drink, some popcorn, feel free to do whatever you need to do. But we'll start back in about 2 minutes. Thank you. Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get started. There'll still be a few trickling in, but we have a lot of stuff to go through today. So I want to make sure that we have adequate time, and I definitely want to make sure that I'm able to get to your questions because that's the most important thing to me. I'll be up here yapping a lot. We're going to say a lot of things. We're going to go over a lot of stuff, but most importantly, I want to make sure that you walk away with information that you can use and apply. So welcome to Maximizing Your Training Results, Part 1. This is a two-part series. This is the role recovery plays in training results. This will set the stage for the next one, which will be July 11th, next month, at the same time. And we will go through how this information relates to preventing and overcoming injury. So we're going to set the stage here. We got a lot of information to get through. Before I do, just a couple of quick things. I will be going through and having some polls that helps me gather information so I can best apply this information to you specifically. And then there are some handouts. So in your toolbar, depending on which format you have, there's kind of two different formats for go-to. Actually, there's probably three if you're on a cell phone, it's a little bit different. But if you're on a web or on your computer, there's a classic version, which you have kind of a control panel on the side, and there's different tabs running down the side of it. You'll see one that says handouts, and there'll be two handouts in there. Just click on those so you can download those. That'll provide you some information that we're going to talk about, and I'll explain that as we go through and get to the end. And then when I ask polls, you'll see things pop up so you can click and answer. I ask that you would answer if you can. That would be awesome. It helps me, and it gives us some percentages for the web. Lastly, when you have questions, and I strongly suggest you ask them, I'm going to take little breaks as we go through so I can answer as many of the questions as possible. There is a questions tab, so just go to the questions tab, click on that, and you can type in your question. If you have the new version, The new version has a kind of a toolbar, a black toolbar across the top, and it'll have the same thing. Sometimes you have to click on the dot, 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 which says more to get to the chats, handouts, questions, and all that stuff as well. Okay, that said, with all that information, what I like to do is start with the very first two polls, just helps me to get some information. So what I'd like to know is which of the following best represents who you are. So are you strength coach, personal trainer, athlete, fitness enthusiast, owner, operator, other? Just select the one that's most appropriate to you, or the one that you want to be seen as today anyway. Okay, beautiful. Got a lot of fitness enthusiasts. I love that in athletes. Those of you that are athletes and fitness enthusiasts, you're going to hear information that can be dramatically important for you, but even more important, we'll translate that into next time. Others, I'm assuming you might be physical therapist, massage therapist, some type of licensed professional. That's typically what we have. If there's anything different than that, please feel free to let me know. And I'm glad to see we have a healthy amount of strength coaches and personal trainers. This is vital for what you're going to be doing and what you do with people, and something that you're going to hear a lot of information here that we don't typically hear in the industry, unfortunately. Okay, thank you for that. Now, the last one to start with is this your first Eleiko Strength Talk, yes or no? Just a real quick one. I want to see how many people have been here and how many people have not been here. Excellent. Pretty close. Almost 50-50. Okay, beautiful. Thank you guys so much for answering that. I deeply appreciate your interaction. So with that being said, for those of you who may not know who I am, my name is Rodney Korn, and I am the Director of Education here at Eleiko. And I've been here for about 5 years now. I've been in the industry for about 35 years and really focusing on education for the last 25 years. So I've been around the block a little bit. I started when I was about 2. That was a joke. Okay, so just wanted to see if you guys are still alive and awake. And let's jump into this particular set of information now. So we can talk about the role that recovery plays in this. So first off, when we're talking about getting results in any type of training program, regardless of what the results are, weight loss, strength, speed, agility, quickness, all the things that can happen, those are the results. There's a very simple equation to get those results, and it's simply stress plus recovery is how you get those results. When we talk about stress and recovery, that's the amount and timing of each of those. So the amount and timing of stress, the amount and timing of recovery, and that's going to determine the degree of adaptation that you get, which is your result. While this is a very simple equation to determine results, where the complexity lies is in the definitions and understanding of the terms stress and recovery. And this is where the industry, in my opinion, having been in it for 35 years, has done a very poor job. And as an educator, I take blame for that because we haven't done a good job in understanding and defining and educating people on what stress and recovery are. So that's what we're going to do here. So before I get into all of this, I have one more poll that I want to ask you. It is very simple. Is stress good or bad to you? What do you think? Is it good or bad? Love it. Love it. Love it. Okay, so we had about an 85, 15%. 85 said good, about 15% said bad. Thank you for that, because I appreciate that. So most people are understanding now that stress is a good thing. If you're told that stress is a bad thing, you were incompletely told, or there's an incomplete understanding of what stress is. So let's go through. We are going to define these terms for you right now. So first and foremost, stress. Stress is every sensation that you will experience. Everything that happens to you every single minute, second of every day is stress by definition. When I say sensation, I mean all the incoming stimuli that all of your senses receive, every sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, movement, and every other sense that we're not even aware of, they're all stressors, and they are all technically stress. And this is something that if you don't understand this, then you're missing the whole boat of what stress is and how to recover and how to eventually prevent and overcome injury. So stressors trigger a response both consciously and subconsciously. Subconsciously, your electromagnetic fields from your cell phones, that's a stressor. So there's all kinds of 5G towers all over. Those are stressors. So today we have more innate stress on our systems than we have over the last 100 years because of all the new gadgets and things that we have. There's more stress to the system. All right. So stress, every sensation that you get, every receptor in your body that's receiving some information, that is a stressor because it's a force that's applied that's knocking your system, your body, your whole being out of its homeostatic position. Okay. So stress, every sensation. Recovery is stress management. It is the management of those sensations. It's a continuous responsive process to all of these stressors that promotes a return to an optimal or desired state of physical, mental, and emotional function. The key with recovery is that it's a continuous process. It is always happening because we always have stressors on the system. So there's always a response to it. And I'll talk about this. We're going to detail this a lot in the first few slides. But you have to understand recovery is a continuous process. It's always occurring. It doesn't start after a training session. It starts before your training session. It's always going on. And it's a process. Recovery is a process. Now, here's what we don't hear a lot in the industry. There's a difference between recovery and recovered. Recovered is stress that's been managed. Recovery is the process of managing it. Now, I'm going to show you pictures and graphics and different things. So if you're not necessarily a verbal person, you'll see this visually here in a second. It's the completion of the recovery process. Being in a state of recoveredness, being recovered, is the completion of recovery. Two different events, two different things. Vitally important to understand. This determines your readiness. Readiness is your current ability level. As we'll talk about, it's constantly changing. Your current ability level will change throughout the day, day to day. That is another vitally important thing to understand about how your system works. That leads to how do I train properly and what do I do with people on a day-to-day basis. Because writing a program, especially periodized programs, will not periodize specifically to the person. So you may be missing the mark. So if you don't have a way to assess recovery, assess stress and fatigue, you're just throwing darts in the dark. You have no idea if you're even close to that person or not. That's why we need to understand these topics and understand this information. That's why there's so many injuries that can be prevented. Musculoskeletal injuries can be prevented and can be overcome when they happen if you understand how the body operates. Okay, stage number one. When we talk about readiness, that's your indication of your current level of fatigue or recovery, because recovery is based on the amount of fatigue that you have. It reveals the level of physical, mental, and emotional ability that you have at any specific point in time. Readiness is a specific point in time, and that's to do whatever you have to do. Now I want to talk real quick about when we say readiness, there's a lot of biometric data out there. I'll use Whoop as an example because Whoop is a fantastic tool. But when you get your readiness score in the morning, that readiness score will not be the same at noon. It will not be the same at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And this is where a lot of the biometric data and these systems fail us because we rely on that. It says, okay, I'm ready. And there's another reason why we can do better with those in time. I won't get into that now. I might get into that in the next one. But when you get a readiness score from an app or some type of heart rate variability mechanism or whatever mechanism that you're using, and you take it in the morning because they say take it in the morning because that's when you're ready. That's true. That's when you get the best picture. But if you train at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and you've gone through a whole day of stress, that readiness is going to change, like it or not. That's just how the body works. So those are things that we have to be very careful of. Okay? Hope everyone's following. All right, let's get in real quick. The body's response to stress. This is the HPA axis in simplicity. So when we respond to stress, all the stressors, that influences and affects every system in our body. That's why it creates fatigue, or can. Stressors are received by the limbic system, which is that gray area in the brain. That's called your emotional center, okay? The emotional center, and there's a little organ in there, your amygdala, a little section of the brain, and that sends a help signal to the hypothalamus, which is just at the bottom of that gray area. And that's the system that it says that we're out of balance here. We got hit by a stressor. We're no longer in homeostasis, that's just imaginary. That doesn't actually exist. It's always going back and forth. We've been knocked out, so we have a stressor. The hypothalamus then triggers your pituitary gland to send a message to your adrenal glands that sit on top of your kidneys to produce adrenaline and cortisol. Okay, those are good things. We need all this. This is all good. This isn't bad. This is good. This is just how it works. This promotes the stress response, which we'll talk about in a second, is the fitness fatigue, stimulating the sympathetic system of the autonomic nervous system, which results in inflammation. Just like stress, inflammation is good. We have to have inflammation. Inflammation is what brings in all the healing agents to repair the body. So we need inflammation. This is why this system is designed. This is why we were created to have this system. But when you have poor or incomplete recovery, means we can't manage our stress well, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. It leads to sustained inflammation or prolonged inflammation, which will then negatively impact all the other systems in your body. So the key is we have to complete that inflammation cycle. We have to let the body go through its natural processes in order to create healing so then we can move. If we can help enhance that, that's a great thing. But there's a caveat, so remember that when we get there. Okay, from a little different perspective, recovery is what I call the autonomic nervous system dance. It's always happening. So you have the sympathetic stressors coming in, fatigue on one side. Sorry guys, that's you. The parasympathetic is the recovery. That's the fitness. That's the building up. That's the combating. Okay, so there's a continual process to balance our system. We have stressors coming in, and for every stressor that comes in, there's a recovery response that responds to that. So we're constantly balancing back and forth and back and forth and back and forth to combat. Because if the body just got bombarded with stress after stress after stress after stress, and it was never doing anything, it would pile up so huge that we'd have to have this massive response. And that's not how it happens, even though sometimes after you train a certain way, it feels like that's how it happens. That's not exactly correct. Okay? Always a constant dance. So this slide is from these next slides are going to be vitally important to understand, and we're going to put this whole thing together. Okay, so this is how it works. We have an incoming stressor. The body is now being stressed. Doesn't matter what it is. Doesn't matter if it's mental, emotional, physical, doesn't matter. Immediately, we have a fatigue response, which triggers a fitness response. This is why stress is so important. Stress creates a fatiguing response. It stresses the system to force it to have to do something to combat that, which is how we create an adaptation or the ability to get to an adaptation, and how we create a positive or fitness response is what we call it. Okay? So as fatigue starts to decrease, that's the recovery response. All right? As we recover, you'll notice that as the red line goes up towards the black line, that green line goes up higher. So there is a correlation between less fatigue equals more fitness. That's your readiness. That's how you get and understand where readiness is. When you're recovered, it's when you've gotten to the completion of the recovery process. The completion of the recovery process is when there's the best ratio between stress and fitness, and that's when you have your highest readiness, noted by the yellow dotted line right there. You'll notice that recovery never gets to zero because we're always under stress. Gravity. We can't escape gravity unless you go to the moon. Gravity is a stressor. There's always input that's coming in. So there's always a little bit of stress. We need stress to live. What happens if you take away gravity? We die. Why? Because the body needs stress to constantly keep itself active and promoting and growing. That's why as we age, things start to decrease and we no longer can do it because the stress overtakes us. We don't have the ability to manage that. So this slide right here lays the foundation. You see the recovery process, you see recovered. That recovered state gives you an optimal fitness, which is an optimal readiness, and that's your optimal point for training on a consistent basis, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. Look at it another way. So think of it as stress. Looking at this image, your bucket is how much stress you can actually tolerate. That bucket's going to be different for everybody. We all have different abilities to tolerate stress. That's our capacity. The water is all of the stressors that are coming into the body. And then down there, you'll see the holes. Those are the coping strategies or our recovery strategies. That's how we get the recovery process going. If there's too much stress or we have excessive stress coming in, water, without, this is the key, without a way to release or decrease it, we're going to exceed our capacity. The water is going to overflow, and that's when we get into a state of distress. That's when stress becomes bad, is when we can't manage it. That's the only time stress becomes bad, is when it can't be managed. Stress in and of itself isn't bad. It's the management process. If your management's poor, stress is bad. If your management's great, stress is good. Okay? When this happens, this distressed state leads to prolonged inflammation, which we just talked about in the previous slides, which is when we get exhausted, breakdown, and that's when injury will occur. That's when injury happens. Matter of fact, I've been training people using understanding training loads and heart rate variability and this process that we're going to talk about in a second on how to assess recovery and readiness. I've been using this for 15 years, and I've trained a lot of different athletes, and I've trained a lot of different people, and you can almost predict when someone's going to get injured. And actually, there's research that shows that there is a prediction. You can predict when someone's going to get injured or when they're at the highest point for risk of injury. But we're never told that in the industry. We have to dig for it. So if you take this away here, you can minimize your risk of injury, and you can help prevent it and overcome it in yourself and or those people that you train or work with. Now, too little stress, not enough incoming stress, as we talked about, coming in the bucket can be like a sedentary person. It makes us stagnant. So we don't have enough stimulation. This can also lead to distress and or injury and illness, as we've seen with sedentary. So don't think it's just too much stress, it's too little. Now, one thing to really, really take a hold of, a lot of stress on your system does not increase your risk of injury. It's not how much stress you're under, it's how well you manage it. So just because there's a lot of stress does not mean that that's bad. It's, are you able to manage that stress? So if you're a trainer, coach, or if you're some type of therapist, or you're somebody that you need to know how that person is responding. You have to be able to assess them. And there's a variety of simplistic ways that I'm going to talk about to assess how people, because everyone's going to respond to stress different. I don't care if it's a therapeutic protocol. I don't care if it's the same program. Those of you that have trained multiple athletes and you have a program that you work with, you know that some athletes, that isn't anything for them. Other athletes can't walk the next day. Why is that? It's because everyone's different. We have to train people to their level or we're going to break them. Simple as that, or yourself. Okay, so let's put all this together now. So we have the incoming stressor, And we already talked about the inflammation. When that incoming stressor hits, we go through the HPA axis, the stress response, that creates inflammation. Inflammation is the trigger for pain. So pain is caused by inflammation, and that's what creates a fatigue state. Not the pain, but the inflammation, because that's the body's immune response to what's happening. It's trying to get in and repair itself. So it's in the recovery state. That's what triggers recovery to trigger fitness. So think of the incoming stressor as all the water. So you see the water on the right-hand side. We've got inflammation coming in. Now we get to the recovery process. The body's going to automatically try to enhance its recovery or increase recovery because of the inflammation that's coming in and cleaning out all the byproducts and all the things that are happening with the stress response. Okay, so the holes in the bucket have been opened up. Recovery is starting to happen, but that's not recovered. That's just the start of the recovery process. Recovered, and that's again where we get readiness. Recover is when we've hit that state. So you see that red line on the right there by the bucket. Recovered is when we've got the water in our bucket below the holes. So we're not still releasing stress. We've got the water below. That's when you're recovered. What happens is if you do not know how to assess people and find out where they're at, we may think that is recovered. We may think that red line, and you can see there's still holes that are underneath that red line. So they haven't really recovered, they're still recovering. And you can see that that readiness means that they're shifted down to the left, so their readiness isn't as high as it could be or should be, depending on what you're trying to accomplish in that person or yourself. Now, you can train in this area right here, but you better know how much stress to put on somebody if they're in this state. So there are times when athletes or military personnel, or even yourself as a fitness enthusiast, depending on what you're trying to do, may train in that state. And it's okay to train in that state, but you need to know how to adjust your volume, which is the amount of stress on your training, so you don't overstress the system and end up going backwards instead of continually going forward. I hope that makes sense. If you don't know how to assess, you may think this is recovered because everyone else says, well, I just wait 24, 48 hours and then you can do it again. Well, what if that's not you? What if that's not the person you're training with? You may be here. So if you have 3 different places, just for example, on this chart, that someone says you as a strength coach or a trainer, you as yourself, or you as a medical professional or a licensed professional says this is where somebody should start hitting it hard again, but they're at 3 different spots. Which one are they and how do you know? And will they get a different outcome based upon the protocol or the session that they're doing relative to where they are right now in their readiness? So I hope that makes sense. I hope you understand the importance of understanding what stress is, understanding the difference between recovery and recovered, and how that affects your readiness, your current ability level to train or to perform a specific function or task at that time. If we understood this as an industry, our military wouldn't be absolutely overwhelmed and inundated with musculoskeletal injuries. We have a contract with US Navy and we're trying to actually get this across and accomplish this, but it's still difficult because people who work with these people don't understand this. If you're a coach or trainer, if you don't understand this, you're setting your clients up for failure. Licensed professionals, same way. We need to understand this concept and not just rely on biometric information, because the biometric information has holes in it that I would love to tell you about. I just don't have time. That doesn't always do exactly what we want it to do. We have to be in tune with ourselves, and you have to be in tune with your client. That is the best way right now. Using biometrics can help support it. And I'm saying that based on experience because I've worked with a lot of different biometrics that I've used, data collection, and I've tested this with what the system says versus what the person's saying. And the person is 99% of the time right because that's what their perception is. And then it comes down to a coach's eye. It's a whole different story. So When we have all this, if we have prolonged stress, if we do not manage our stress properly, it will lead to a decrease in your results. And I don't care again what the adaptation is. It'll decrease your ability to lose weight or lose fat. And it will also increase your risk of injury. Here's a flow chart of what happens, and this is how injury actually occurs and happens. So number one, these are all scientifically supported, so I just don't have the references here. Number one, when we have prolonged stress, we have an altered immune system function. It decreases our ability to manage the stress, period. Number two, huge, inability to downregulate inflammation. This is the number one factor promoting musculoskeletal injuries. Inflammation is the number one cause of musculoskeletal injuries and most all major diseases. Number three here, inflammation, this response, and specifically inflammation, will decrease the recruitment of type 1 muscle fibers and alter muscle spindle function, which decreases stability, mobility, and overall adaptation that we're trying to create. That's a big one, specifically for musculoskeletal injuries, which is actually being correlated now to ACL injuries, which they can't seem to figure out, but they're trying to find out, because it's not just about stability training, and I'll talk about that in a second. I'm going to talk about what stability really is here pretty soon. Okay, so it decreases recruitment of type 1 muscle fibers and muscle spindles, and it also dehydrates connective tissue. The vastness of that statement is that when we decrease the ability of this tissue, the connective tissues, to stiffen, remember, your connective tissues is what transfers forces. Real quick anatomy, muscles generate force. Connective tissue transfers that force to the bone and joint. So if the muscle isn't working, type 1 muscle fibers and muscle spindles, then that's putting more stress on the connective tissue, tendons, and ligaments to try to create support. And that's not what they're designed to. They're designed to transfer, not create. So when you place more force on the connective tissue in a dehydrated state, which means it has less ability to transfer force and less ability to create stiffness, you now increase your risk of injury. And those of you that deal with injury, what's predominantly injured? Muscle or connective tissue? Connective tissue. That's why we have the injuries that we have. This summarizes why we have the injuries that we have. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and I just want to see, are there any questions to this point? Do we have any questions about anything? So focus on training seniors over 10 years advanced fitness strength and via lifting resistance, osteoarthritis, problematic as a stressor, how best to accommodate. So that's a pretty complicated question when you're talking about seniors that are osteoarthritic or have rheumatoid arthritis. The key is movement, but it has to be. And I'm gonna answer this probably later on in the slides. The key is that they have to go to their ability level. That's the first and foremost. That's how we'll accommodate them. And it's, do they have proper muscle activation? That's what's going to come down to it. So let me talk about that and address that in some of the future slides, because I'm going to get to that when we start talking about assessing. Okay, great question. Can you please read and say the question louder for us to understand? Okay, I don't have a question yet, but when I do, I'll make sure I say it loud enough. All right, so let's get back to the course. Here we go. So this is some things that we need to know. First off, I have to mention recovery methods because we're talking about recovery. So we know that there's massage guns and foam rolling, and there's stretching, and there's breathing and activation, and we have infrared light saunas, and we have hot and cold plunges. You guys know all this stuff. There's some of the things you may not know is actually your self-talk, your conversations, and your visualization or imagery, what you see yourself doing. Those have influence on your recovery as well. And then nutrition and hydration, massively important for that. So with all of these that are said right here, let me ask this question for you in a poll. So you guys answer this one for me. What do you do for recovery? Which one of these do you do for recovery? Excellent. Great. So most people foam roll, massage, and stretch. I'm going to say most people probably stretch. Would that be a safe bet? Most people probably stretch more than they foam roll. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. All right. So thinking all the way back to the very beginning of what we talked about, all of these applications that we've just gone through, every form of these recovery, what are they? What are those? What are those? What are every one of those forms of recovery? What actually is it? It's a stressor. And here's another thing you will never hear in the industry. I haven't heard this, and this is such a passion of mine, and I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've been going through so much information and so much research, and there's so much more to learn. But every one of those, they're not wrong. They're all great. They all can be helpful. But how do you know? How do you know that what you're doing is actually working and actually promoting recovery to a recovered state and not just adding more stress to the system? That's the biggest question. Because we have a course. So a lot of this information is in an online course we just launched. It's called Readiness and Recovery Training. And we go over all this stuff. We go through applications. We go through everything. And we've done two live courses with this now. And what's always great is when I get to this kind of section in the live course and I start talking about how all of the recovery strategies that are out there, it doesn't matter what they are, because they're sensations that causes stress to the body. We're told they're recovery. So if you do them, people are under the assumption that if I do that, I'm going to get recovered. That's not true. If you do that, depending on how you do it, you might help promote recovery, but it does not mean you're going to get recovered from doing those. They're just stress to the body. It's not bad, but it depends on how much you do and what you're doing with it. So when I get to this section, there's always people in the live course who, and I'll use one guy as an example because it was the perfect. Raise their hand. Oh, no wonder. And I was like, no wonder what? He goes, I have recovery days. And he says, on my recovery day, I do foam rolling, and then I do I go to a sauna, and I do a hot tub and a cold plunge. And he said, when I finish, I actually feel worse than when I started. And that's totally true. And I would expect that because you're doing too much. More is not better. The right amount is better. So if we don't know how stressed we are and we don't know how much recovery we're getting, then what are we doing? So we need much more understanding of what recovery is. And just because the industry labels something as a recovery agent does not mean you're going to get recovered. And it doesn't even mean that it's actually going to help you get recovery because it depends on how much you're doing. So these are things that are vitally important to understand as we start talking about recovery, training results, increasing performance, whatever it is that you're trying to do. So remember, every one of those is a form of stress. It is a stressor to your system. So when we are looking at the body, you need to understand tissue dynamics and how they relate to stress, because this is something else that we don't do. And I'll give you a practical example in a second. So number one, the range of motion that you take your body through, the higher or larger ranges of motion you take your body through is more stress to the system because it's more stress to the tissue. It isn't wrong. It isn't bad. It's just, that's the way it is. Lower range of motion, less stress. Higher range of motion, more stress. That's it. Speed, the slower you go, less stress. The faster you go, more stress. That's all it is. force, how much load you use, or how much time is under tension. The lower, the less stress. The higher amount, the more stress. Contractions, you have concentric, you have isometric, you have eccentric. Concentric and isometric, depending on your load and your speed and your range of motion, can have potentially less stress. Eccentric, depending on the force, the speed, and the range of motion, has more stress. So the most degrading way to, or the easiest way to tear down and break down tissue is to do a fast, a loaded, high speed, eccentric contraction. That's just science. It's not bad. It's just letting you know. We need to understand how the tissues work and what creates more stress. Because if I have somebody who's extremely stressed, when they come into me, they haven't recovered very well. Why would I take them through all the high stuff? Why would I go through large ranges of motion, faster speeds, and higher forces, and do elongated or eccentric contractions under a higher load? That doesn't make sense. But we think that's what we're supposed to do. So there's people who, I totally get the SAID principle. You get a specific adaptation imposed demand. I get that. But when the body is not at its optimal state, you can't train for that particular function. You can't take athletes. You don't have to take an athlete through high speed, heavy load all the time, because all you'll do is break them down, and then you'll miss out on the other adaptations that they're going to need to have anyway. So this is why periodization can work, but you have to have personalized periodization. You need to know when a person is in a certain level of readiness in order to find out which type of training they should do. I'll give an example. People warm up. They do warm-ups, but they'll use dynamic motion. I'll give you two scenarios. They'll use dynamic motion, they'll use large range of motion, that they're trying to force their body into a range of motion. So if I'm forcing my body to go into a range of motion that it's not necessarily prepared to do, is that going to create more stress or less stress? And you should all be saying it's going to create more stress. Exactly. So why would I do that with a person who's not in optimal functional state right now? There's no reason to, because the body is only going to fight me because it doesn't want to do that. We tell the body what to do more than we ask the body what it should be doing and what it wants to do. Are there times we have to go outside? Yes. But then that means that you have to understand the recovery process from that. So we don't need to go through fast, large range of motion warm-ups because we're going to go sprinting. We need to prepare the system and ramp it up. And this is where we lose sight of the whole contraction continuum. We lose sight of how muscle fibers and muscle motor units work. We lose sight of everything because we see stuff and we think that's what we're supposed to do. We see people who take 50-pound kettlebells or a 20-kilo kettlebell and they'll set it on their knee and they're trying to create dorsiflexion with their, you're forcing the body to do something that it's not capable of doing. How do you think it will respond to you? It's going to fight you. That's what it does. And then you can override the system, but have you actually helped the system or have you hurt the system, and how do you know? Because we don't test muscle function. We just look for range of motion. Those are two totally different things. Two totally different things. Okay, so understand tissue dynamics. There's a lower end and there's a moderate end, and we can go in between. So in our course, we talk about mobility drills. There are mobility drills that we call fascial mobilizers. And the fascial mobilizers are a slow rhythmical motion. So when someone is stressed, or if you're trying to prepare someone to get to a higher, faster range of motion, you can use these to get the tissue to move and create fluidity and still not threaten the system. So it's better prepared to do something. And it works phenomenal. And that's why we have a specific sequence that we've laid out at LACO. It's not that you have to use every form of the sequence, but there's a specific sequence that we walk you through that's based upon tissue dynamics, that's based upon understanding stress, and based upon research. So that's why we need to understand that, okay? So now let's get into assessing recovery. This is vital, okay? This is extremely important. This one right here is an absolute game changer. It's stupid simple to do and use. I've been using this for 15 years, and it has changed my training radically, and it has helped so many of the clients that I've worked with to do things that they never thought they were going to do. I don't have time to tell the stories. So what we have is it's assessing perceived readiness and recovery. This will work. I guarantee this because I've used it for 15 years. This will work as good as any biometric collection on your heart rate variability or your apps or anything, your wearables. This will work as good as anything, and it only takes a couple of minutes, and it's four simple questions that you're going to look at, and you're going to do it yourself, so you'll find out. Remember, your readiness and recovery will change from day to day, even hour to hour, because of the fatigue stress management process that we've already talked about. You can subjectively measure this through a survey, which this is validated through research. It's been around for 25, 30 years. You just don't hear about it in the industry because we don't dig into research. We follow people and what's being said. So this is something that will work. I guarantee it because I've used it on hundreds of people and taught it all over the world for the last 15 years. We call it our readiness and well-being score. It's called RAW score. And so we look at 4 different pillars: sleep, physical, mood, and nutrition. Okay? So here's how it works. If you can see your screen, just rate yourself on these 4 pillars, and that's how fast it is. On your sleep, have you slept 6 or more hours? And if you haven't slept, if you've slept less than 6 hours, let me start with 1 is poor, 3 is good. If you slept less than 6 hours and you don't feel well rested, even regardless if you've slept more than that, but you don't feel well rested at all, then that's a 1. If you do not feel very well rested, you just kind of then that's a 2. If you had a good 8 hours or more sleep and you feel very well rested, then that's a 3. From a physical, do you have pain, tightness, fatigue? Then there's several symptoms that you have, then that's a 1. If you have pain or tightness or you have fatigue and there's a few symptoms, that's a 2. If you have no issues, then you're a 3. Your mood, do you feel agitated, a little anxious, kind of stressed as the term goes? That's a 1. If you're kind of neutral, blah, then that's a 2. If you're kind of vibrant and ready, that's a 3. Be careful if that's caffeinated, vibrant and ready. Caffeinated, vibrant and ready can mask what's actually a 2 or a 1. And the nutrition, do you have poor quality of food and poor hydration? Then that's a 1. Fair, 2, good, 3. So you rate yourself. So you should have a score on that. You have 4 different scores. You're going to add them up and have a total score. If you're at 10 to 12, that means you have minimal stress. That means whatever you're going to be doing at that particular time, you're ready to do that. If you're 7 to 9, it means you're under some moderate stress, so you're going to have a caution flag. If you're 4 to 6, it means you're under a lot of stress, so you're going to have a double caution flag. Okay, it doesn't mean you can't do anything, it just means you need to know what you're going to do. So hopefully you have an understanding now of what your score is. And that's how fast it is. So every one of my clients that I train, I take this before I train them. So before I work with them, I find out where they are based upon their score. Now I know what to do in their program, so I'm not going beyond that. And this is what that looks like. So when I take that raw score, looking at the cup on the left-hand side, that raw score tells me how much stress or how much fatigue are they currently under. The more that's in that cup, the less I can train them. The less fatigue, the less water in the cup, the more I can train them. It's that simple. That's how it works. So if you're a 4 to 6, or you're working with someone that's a 4 to 6, then that means you need to reduce the volume of that session by about 25 to 30%. This is based upon 15 years of doing this. So about 25 to 30%, and you can do it by reducing the number of sets and or the number of reps and or the total session length and or just how much rest you're putting into that. So you have to increase the rest. So your sets and your reps and your rest can work. So it doesn't matter if someone's supposed to be training heavy that day. Depending on who they are, their training age, we go over all this in the online course, so I'm not going to spend tons and tons of time going over it. But depending on who they are, their training age and how much they've been doing what they're currently doing, they don't have to change the load. They don't have to change much. They just need to reduce the volume. Okay? This is not the time to introduce a new complex exercise to someone. So if someone's never done a full snatch, don't do it on this day if they're a 4 to 6. If you're a 7 to 9, you're going to reduce the volume about 15 to 20%. Same method. If you're 10 to 12, you're good to go. Okay, that's how easy that. If you only take that one away and you use it right now, you're going to be so far ahead of the game. You'll do wonders for yourself when you're training, and you'll also do wonders for yourself as a strength trainer and a coach. And by the way, if you're a strength coach, you're a trainer, and this is your revenue stream, this is a way to create differentiation with your training and how you get re-signs. Okay. Assessing mobility. This one is massively overlooked. We do it, but we don't follow up with it properly a lot of times. So when we look at range of motion, that tells us which muscles cannot activate. When I talk about range of motion here, I'm talking about going kind of joint by joint range of motion. Because when we see asymmetry, specifically asymmetry or real lack of motion, that tells us that the muscles that take us into that aren't activating properly. And that's an inflammation signal, because inflammation will shut that down. And I'll talk about that briefly here in a second. So it's due to prolonged inflammation. It means the system is fatigued and the muscles cannot contract to get there. This is because it affects the spindle's proprioception activation. So let me tell you how that works. We're going to walk through a process. You're going to hear something that you probably never heard. If you have heard it, kudos for you, because most people in the industry don't hear this and they don't follow this. And that's why we're in the situation we are. Okay, so number one, let's start with there's different size and types of muscle fibers. We all have seen there's different motor units, muscle fibers. We have type 1, type 2A, type 2X, type 2B, yada, yada. Okay, that type 1 is the most crucial one, because those are the low threshold ones that have to activate first. They activate on demand, subconsciously. They activate subconsciously. And that's what initially creates the force that is transferred through the connective tissue that immediately stabilizes joints. Okay. The size principle, like I just told you, says they activate first. When we have poor stress management and recovery, we have prolonged inflammation, and the inflammation alters the metabolic characteristics. So those type 1s now are delayed. And because they delay, they now become more type 2. And there's plenty of research that shows in a variety of situations that type 1 become more of a type 2A, which means they don't activate on demand. If you start to move and the motor units, your type 1 motor units don't activate, you have a delay. That delay means that joint is not stabilized, and so the joint is moving. Think of yourself walking on ice. If you step on ice, what does your body immediately do? Does it move smoothly and glide, or does it all of a sudden tighten up? That's why. The inflammation decreases muscle spindle sensitivity. In our course, we go through the research and show you how this works. But to be very simple, here's what happens. Your muscle spindles, we're always taught that they're supposed to, you stretch, you activate them. That muscle spindle is a length regulator. Whether the muscle is long or short, it has to go with the muscle. If it cannot shorten, that muscle will not be shortened, and the brain won't register the muscle as being shortened. So we lose muscle spindle sensitivity means that muscle spindle will no longer be able to shorten, and that's due to the alpha gamma coactivation. All that means is that the motor neuron, the neurons that go to the muscle spindle also go to the muscle fibers. They work together. That's the coactivation. Alpha is the muscle, gamma is the spindle. That means that if they can't work together, then they're not instantly activating when they need to. So we don't have instant activation. That means we have a destabilized joint. That means we have poor proprioception. In research, the term proprioception is what is referred to that we call stability. Stability comes through proprioception. If we don't have proper spindle function, we do not have proprioception, proper proprioception. We have an unstable joint and an unstable system. The body can no longer recognize what it's supposed to recognize because we're not getting proper input to the central nervous system. This results in, number one, weakened muscles. If my muscle cannot activate on demand, it is in a weakened state. It no longer has the ability to go through type 1, type 2, type 2X, 2B. It no longer can do that. It has a delay, and then it jumps in and it gets it. But if I can't initially stabilize the joint, that means the joint is unstable. That is a weakened muscle, a weakened state. That destabilizes the joint through proprioception. That's what causes muscle tightness. We're told that muscle tightness causes muscle weakness, but that's impossible because muscle tightness is a result of something. What is it a result of? It doesn't just happen. It's a result of something. There's a difference between muscle tightness and muscle restriction from some type of cast being held and you have some fascial adhesion built up or scar tissue. There's a difference between those two. Activation is the key. Weakened muscles create a tight muscle, and that's where we lose range of motion. If we can assess range of motion and then we can reactivate that, which you can do it instantly. You reactivate that motion and those tissues will reboot. You actually reboot the spindle and now you have motion. The tightness all of a sudden goes away. That's what we teach in our course. And then we take you through a process that show you how to do that. Okay, and then there's a level of perceived. This is the last one. The third way you can assess it, the first two. So number one is the raw score. If you do nothing else, do that. Number two is assessing mobility. It's simple and it does not take long. You can go through your whole body in literally 10 minutes. Assess it and reboot it. And then there's the perceived pain. So you can foam roll your whole body and you can do it in 5 minutes because you don't need to do it 30 seconds per area. Actually, 5 to 10 seconds is more effective and efficient based on how it influences the activation level and how it influences the circulation level. But I won't get into that. That's a whole nother topic. So your level of perceived readiness is noted by the pain in that particular area. The more pain you have in the areas that you foam roll is an indication of inflammation. Why? Because pain is caused by inflammation. So if you foam roll someone's whole body or you foam roll your body and you realize there's pain everywhere, that means you're inflamed. So use that as a way to look at your range of motion and then find out what is not activated, reactivate it, and then you have all of a sudden a body that works better. These are all things, by the way, these things I've used for the last 15 years. And I move as well now as I did when I was 30, and I'm 58, because this works. Otherwise, I wouldn't teach it. And that's the 3 ways that you can assess that are very easy. All right, here's real quick. let me ask you this. Last poll, just for my yahoos, and then we'll finish up. Where do you guys usually put recovery in your training processes? Where do you put recovery? Awesome. All right. So thank you very much. Most people put it at the end. We had a couple rock stars that said all the above. A couple people, maybe one person does during, and some people do it before. Thank you for that. So if we don't understand recovery and how it works, then we're way behind the game. So recovery is an ongoing process. Remember the definition. It's an ongoing process. There's always stuff happening. So our warm-up actually sets us up for better recovery. If you warm the body up, you create better neural activation, muscle activation, better circulation. You actually are able to decrease the amount of stress that the body's going to endure because it's able to accommodate that stress. If you don't do a proper warm-up, which most people don't, then when you're training, you're actually creating more stress and breakdown because you're probably not stabilized very well. So you're creating more breakdown to the system and damage to the system than your recovery is going to actually repair. And most people's recovery is so poor if they recover that they're not actually addressing what they broke down. So we don't know what we're recovering. We don't know what we're warming up. And I always use the example that what we do in the industry for a typical warm-up is we pick exercises that we've seen or been shown. But for most people, they're probably too much. It's too far in advance. Remember, your warm-up exercises are no different than doing exercises in a training session. Nobody in here would start a general person who's just kind of coming off the street with a full snatch or a full clean and jerk from the floor up under load. But yet, when you look at some of the mobility drills that we do for that person, they can't do them, number one. So it's like doing a full snatch or a full clean and jerk. Not the same amount of stress, but to the body, it's still a stress. So you've actually put the body under more stress than it needed at that time. And then you're going to go put them under and train them in their session. And then you're going to cool them down, if you cool them down, which I hope you do or do yourself. Then you do a similar thing again. You're putting more stress on people than they need to have, and it's not specifically directed stress. So if you don't know what to warm somebody up with or how to warm somebody up, should I foam roll them? Should I activate them? Should I stretch them? If you're stretching them, how do you know that that stretch is actually working? How do you know that that stretch didn't actually shut them down because it was too much stress for that particular muscle at that time? These are things that we're never taught in the industry or told about in the industry. So when you warm up, you need to come up with your volume. How much time and how many exercises are you going to use? And what is the exercise selection? What are you going to use? Are you just picking things that say you're supposed to warm up? Or are you picking things that are specific to that person? It's not difficult. It's not difficult if you do a raw score and you do a mobility assessment or the range of motion assessments and you've done some foam rolling. You can easily go through a full-blown workout in under 8 minutes. And it's because I've proved it. We have it on our course that we see, the online course. What's their breathing like? Breathing is massive. That helps recovery right from the beginning. You can recover after each exercise. That helps your recovery in total. Nutrition and hydration. Is someone coming to you dehydrated? If they're coming into you dehydrated, make sure they're getting some water while they're doing their warm-up because that will help them hydrate. So there's simple ways that you can go through all of this. In the session, what's the acute variables? So what does your raw score tell you? What do I change in my acute variables with the raw score? What exercises should I select and how am I going to perform them? Am I doing a circuit where there's no rest? Or am I doing interval training? Or am I doing a continuous bout like an AMRAP? Or do I need to have more rest because they're fatigued? What's the load? How repetitive is the movements? Because that'll fatigue someone, that'll dehydrate tissue the more repetitive it is. What's the breathing? What's their imagery? What's their nutrition during the session? So those are key simple things that we can look at and we can use to promote recovery from the beginning all the way to the end, and then the off days. Remember, recovery always happens. Okay. I appreciate you guys staying on this long. There was so much information and I was just skimming stones across the top of that. There's so much more to get into that. I want to try to answer some questions. I know it's time and the time is up. If you have to go, I totally understand. This will be recorded and you can see that, but I do want to go through and answer questions. Just know that our next strength talk will be preventing and overcoming injury. We're going to take this information and apply it to injury and how can we do that? What does it look like? That's a QR code to the Eleiko Education. You can go there. Don't forget the downloads. Grab those downloads. That'll tell you information here. There's a discount code for all you guys. Just drop in Eleiko webinars if you go to our online courses and grab some of those. Remember, the readiness and recovery training will specifically detail all this and all the processes that you need. And please follow us on Instagram, both Eleiko Education and Eleiko Sport as a company. All right, let me see if I can get to some of these questions. Okay, how can we measure the stress and adapt to fitness? I already talked about that. That's your raw score. Okay, so thank you, Vincent. And Anur, how do you define the quality of food and hydration? What is poor quality of food versus good? Poor quality of food is a lot of processed food, high sugar food, things of that nature. So when we're talking about food in today's age, organic food is obviously better because it doesn't have the higher levels of pesticides that are out there. Drinks, obviously a good source of water, depending on where you live. I live in California. We have pathetic water, so do not drink the tap water. So the type of water you drink, the type of fluids that you drink, are they high sugary content? So just those types of things is what we're talking about, poor food quality. And then the timing of it. Are you eating more on a consistent basis, depending on what you're doing and how you're cycling, just to make sure, because that'll affect blood sugar as well. Thank you. Avara, okay, can the raw score be on just one part of the body? No, the raw score is on an overall thing. If you're looking for one part of the body, that's where I'd go to the foam roll to find out from a pain scale, what is the pain of the tissue in that area? And then I would also do joint range of motion to see what is the joint range. Is there an asymmetry between the two sides? So those are some ways that I would go per body part. Thank you, Alvaro. So Anders, what would be your number one way of recovery? The number one way of recovery is to know how recovered I am or the person that I'm training is, and that's the raw score. The raw score is the number one way that I use to find out where someone is from a recovery standpoint. Remember, recovery isn't something that you do. Recovery is something that you are always doing. So during a training session, how is someone breathing? That is massive for recovery. If I can get someone to recover faster, that means that they're in a better state to do the next set. How someone has warmed up, that's vitally important. How hydrated they are before, how much so all of the things in the raw score will tell you things that you need to work on or what needs to happen for that particular person. That's a great question, and that was a very, very, very simplistic answer, Anders. Thank you. Ted, most people go for an easy run, 20 to 25 minutes. Is that recovery? Not necessarily. For someone who can run a marathon, a 20, 25 minute easy run, that could be recovery. For me, 20, 25 minute run, that would wipe me out. I'm not a runner, even though I did go on a little run this morning. So again, nothing that somebody does should be called recovery. Everything can be recovered. Just because I take a massage gun, which I do use, just because I have a massage gun and I go over the areas of my body does not mean that I'm going to be recovered. That's not what it means. It just means that I used a massage gun depending on how my body was prior to that and depending on what I did and how much of it and what was the amplitude of the unit and what was the speed of the unit. All those factors will determine whether or not that's going to promote recovery. And again, that's the fallacy that we're kind of in the industry. So nothing actually, there are better ways that we can promote recovery, if that makes sense. So I'll keep it at that because that's a big, long answer, but no. What is the minimum hours of sleep to count as a 3? Minimum hours can fluctuate. The kind of the mainstay is the 8-hour mark, but there are people who can sleep 6 to 7 hours and they feel well recovered because that's their normal time. How you feel when you wake up is a general indication of how you slept that night. So that's something, but what we typically say is 7 to 8 hours is kind of the benchmark based on some research. All right, let's see. Karen, is using protein directly after workout a right solution? Yes, using protein after, it depends on the protein too. Obviously, whey protein, and there's different forms. So BCAAs, your branched chain amino acids, those can be vital for right after, immediately after, and even during your session, drinking those. So you also want to have, and if you do that, and then you can have protein with some carbohydrates as well. And this is where protein powders, a lot of time, or different drinks, where it's powdered drink, can assimilate into the body faster. The tough part is, depending on which brand you get, there's a lot of research out there that talks about the fallacy of most of the brands that are out there, and what you're getting, is it really the product that, or the amount that they're saying you are. If you live in the United States, look up .fit. .fit has some fantastic products. I know the owner of that company, and I know that it's third-party validated, for third-party tested. So what's in it has to be there. They're accountable for that. Good question, Karen. Nick, we didn't get to my seniors question. Sorry, I apologize for that, but the seniors question comes down to, I would look at their range of motion. So do they have range of motion, number one? And that's where, if you go to the online course, you take the online course, and sorry, that's a shameless plug, but that's where the information is. I can't go over it here. But if you go we go through the ranges of motion. I would take seniors, because I've worked with, at the club where I train at, I have clients that are anywhere from 70 to 87. and I'll take them through that process. So I'm just looking at their range of motion. And then we show you how to activate if they have lack. It's a very low level concentric contraction into that motion. So if I'm going into right rotation and they can't get there, then I just hold them and they push their shoulder lightly against me just to create that activation, which reboots the muscle spindle. So that's what I do through their body. And you may only do like a certain number of those because depending on their level of fatigue. That's the number one thing that I do with them. Very low level, very, very simple, 10 to 20% contraction max in an isometric shortened range of motion to help them reboot that, and then just get them to do simple movements, very simple movements, slow. So the tissue dynamic continuums, do them in the slow, moderate range to get their body moving because they're already inflamed. You don't need big motions. You don't need lots of load. Sorry it took so long. Thank you for asking that and staying there. Is there a link between cardiac rhythm and the recovery? Yes, so the heart rate variability, the higher the variability of your heart rate, so your heart rate goes beep, 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 the higher the variability between the beats, beep, 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 that means the body is more recovered. It's in a better state. The more synchronized it is, beep, 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 that means the more stressed the body is. So think of it like a gas pedal. The higher RPM, that's more stress. The lower RPM and the engine's kind of boom, 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 boom. That's more recovered. That's as simple as I can make that one. Okay. Let's see. Do you have any specific recommendations for a man with a pacemaker, implantable pulse generator? As long as he's cleared for exercise, everything follows. So if he's been cleared for exercise, everything follows. You may just not want to put him on whole body vibration. That's just because of the vibration mechanism may interfere with the pacemaker sometimes. Okay. Anur, do you have any comments on the Bulgarian method where you max out on your clean or snatch every day in terms of recovery? Do you think it is sustainable? Again, it'll go back to who are you doing it with. So if it was me, who I'm not at a high level, though I do a lot of Olympic lifting in my own training. If I did that on mine, that wouldn't be sustainable for me. So that for me, that wouldn't work. For someone at a high level, remember this was invented for people who are a high level, then that can work, especially because they're number one, used to that pattern, number two, they're used to load, and number three, that they're doing the concentric components of it. They're not lowering it back down, doing eccentric. So that can be for them. For most people, that's not gonna work. But doesn't mean it's bad. It's just for certain people. All right. Is stretching right to do after every exercise? So you bring up a great question, Karen, that this is actually a whole weekend seminar almost. So stretching, the way we typically do stretching, overrides the system to create range of motion. So one of the fallacies in research, looking at tons of research in foam rolling, stretching, they're always looking to, can I increase range of motion? Range of motion isn't the issue. It's the control of the motion that you have that is the issue. So we can increase range of motion, but you'll notice in most people that stretch, it'll come right back. It'll come right back to where it was. So we're always stretching. If you're always stretching, then it's not working. So that means it's not working for you. And when you override the system, one of the things that can happen, remember when you stretch, especially if you're stretching kind of in an extreme where you're doing a static stretch where you're holding longer time under tension and you have higher ranges of motion, that's actually putting more stress on the system. What we found through muscle testing, and I'm basing this, I have the great fortune of knowing Greg Roscoff, the muscle activation, the inventor of muscle activation techniques. He's a fantastic person, and I've learned tons through him and have worked with him, and he's worked on me. And what we find is through muscle testing, and I do this on my clients, if someone stretches and then you go test that muscle, it'll oftentimes turn up weak. So you might have more range of motion, but they have no control over that range of motion. And if that muscle's weak and it no longer has proper spindle function, that means it's affecting something else somewhere else in the body. So this is where stretching because we just go right to stretching. Everyone's always about stretching and lengthening and all these things. If that muscle can't shorten, something else can't lengthen. And if we're trying to stretch muscles because they can't lengthen, it means something else can't shorten. So find out what can't shorten, get it to shorten, and that'll all of a sudden do. We do that all the time. It's what I do all the time is people come in and they're really tight in something. So I'm like, okay, well, let's find out what your range of motion is. Range of motion lax. Okay. The muscle that takes you into that range of motion. So if I'm doing horizontal adduction right here, and because there's tightness back here and I can't feel it, but all of a sudden I get this to go, then next thing I know, I have all this motion and there's no tightness. It's because the spindles, we work, stretching works on tissue. The activation works on neurophysiology. So we can override neurophysiology, but we're going to do it at the detriment of something else. So I hope that makes sense. It's not that stretching is wrong or bad, because it's like everything else, it can be. But if you don't know if it's working, then you're compromising somebody because you don't know what's happening. Just because people say to stretch does not mean that we should stretch. Activation doesn't hurt people because it's a low level, low load contraction. You can't hurt somebody doing that unless you do it wrong. Stretching could technically hurt somebody, not the way you think of it, but it could actually decrease their function. And if they decrease their function, then they go train, all of a sudden they start having these weird injuries or they start getting these pains. It's because it hasn't helped the body. You've overridden its natural function. Okay. So we've gone 15 minutes. I've answered all the questions. I want to thank you guys so much. You guys were fantastic. Those of you that still stayed on, I appreciate that. And I hope this was helpful and informative for you. I hope to see you guys in July, the next one, when we talk about preventing injury. We kind of touched on a lot of the things that we are going to now discuss and get a little bit more detailed in on the next one. Thank you all. Bye-bye.